a refresher, these are lovely NNIP staff. Most are on the call. And then I'll give it over to Kathy to talk us through the new Microsoft grant program.
Sure. I just wanted to acknowledge that we officially announced last month our grantees for the first Microsoft Catalyst grant program, which we're doing with Microsoft. And it really was a testimony to the work, the quality of work that NNIP did with them in our criminal justice project a couple of years ago, that they wanted to see more groups being able to use data. And many of you spent time giving nominations because it was a nominated process. So both people who applied and sharing amazing groups from your local communities made a big difference in the success of the program. And they're looking to expand it for future rounds. So that's great. And do you want to go to the next slide? There's a website with all of the descriptions of the 9 grantees but 3 of the projects have NNIP grantee, either Urban Strategies Council is a direct grantee. It's only for nonprofits. They're working on this really amazing support for an alternative to 911 program, that diverts certain codes to more community engaged social worker kind of, not official social worker, but more on the sort of diversion, non-police staff, and doing a community survey around expectations on that program. Just City and Innovate Memphis are working on with their bail fund. If anybody's from Memphis, they can speak up to correct me. They're really thinking about sustainability, which we all know is a challenge on data extraction and processing from the very beginning as part of their data stewardship program, and putting then a dashboard together with all this, impossible data in these various impossible websites in one place for communities to use. And then stuff for people from the Polis Center are working specifically on jail data to understand who's incarcerated in jail. Many people who are incarcerated in jail haven't even been, haven't been tried yet. And they're also training grassroots leaders to run their community survey about experiences with law enforcement. They have a new sort of civilian oversight board, but the civilian oversight board doesn't have a lot of power or ammunition yet to really think about how they guide the criminal justice, oversee the criminal justice system. So it's feeding directly into that new policy work. So you'll hear more about them, I'm sure, as they move along in their projects, but I wanted to share, and there's other fantastic groups of doing really good work that I'll share through the listserv as we go along too. Next. We wanted to remind you about the schedule. Look, Leah just jumped right up at that registration on the root causes webinar. This is the first webinar. We had the racial equity goals sort of overview. Justin from Memphis and John from Durham gave some really insightful, honest reflections on what they've been doing. This is the first one where we're diving into one of our racial equity goals. And if someone from the team could paste that goal link in there, those goals are public now, and we've been sharing them with a lot of different people. And Sonia and Leah have been working hard on this one. We have office hours that we always love to hear from people, either just updates or if there's particular questions or you just miss us. And then you should have all received yesterday an invitation to our 25th anniversary panel with Lisa Hamilton, the head of the Casey Foundation, who's been funding us for 25 years. And Angela Glover Blackwell, one of the very early NNIP partners in Oakland, who now then founded PolicyLink. And is really an amazing speaker. So we're excited about that, and probably doing something informal the week of the 15th, like maybe just a happy hour or something, not to load people on, maybe convince Rob Patingolo to do a trivia reprise. And then we're doing this office hours in December and trying to keep December light for you, because we know end of the year is hard for everybody wrapping things up. So that's all the updates that we had. Oh, there's one more thing. We'll send out a note more particularly. I forgot to add a slide on. Leah and I just published a report brief with funded by the Data Funders Collaborative on building trust in data use that we're really excited about. It's more conceptual than, but what's a great opportunity. I'm sure you guys have had these to like really organize your thoughts and put everything down in one place that you think people should know, and how they should think about the world. So we were really fortunate to be able to get this commission from the collaborative. It talks about rights in data and harms in data for individuals and for collective, and outlines all of those, and then talks about a typology for approaches to building data trust, which you all are, your local work definitely inspired and informed our thinking about how that is done to try to encourage funders. The paper is aimed at philanthropy, but the frameworks we'll be using definitely going forward for lots of things. And we'll send that, I was supposed to write an abstract. I'll finish that and send that along to you in the next couple of days. Anything else, Leah or Sonia, to add on the general updates? I think that's my last slide, right, Elizabeth?
Nope, we're good.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Kathy.
No, so we'll leave it and go to the main events.
Yeah, so thank you to all of our presenters today. We'll start off with Leah Sakala from the Urban Institute presenting on the DC Police Budget Tool. And then we'll go to Peter Ciurczak, sorry, I probably pronounced that incorrectly, and Annie Calef from the Boston Indicators, presenting on the 15-minute neighborhoods. And then Ellie Lochhead is joining us from the Housing Solutions Lab in New York on the variations in ERAP application rates across New York State. And then we'll finish with Layla Bellows from Neighborhood Nexus in Atlanta, presenting on the Equity Atlas and Beltline. So I'll pass it over to Leah and stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here speaking with you all. My name is Leah Sakala, and I'm a Senior Policy Associate in the Justice Policy Center at Urban. And I apologize that I'll have to hop off at about 2:30, but I'm really excited to be able to share some brand new work with you, specifically focusing on democratizing police budget data. And really the reason this project came about was because, as I'm sure everybody knows, as you're seeing in your own jurisdictions, 2020 was a really important year for conversations about public safety and resources related to public safety. I live and work here in DC, and we were just seeing in our own backyard, there was unprecedented interest in engaging in police oversight hearings and police budget conversations. But both advocacy organizations and grassroots organizers, as well as policymakers, were feeling really frustrated at how opaque and seemingly impenetrable information on the DC police budget was. These are documents that are uploaded annually in PDF format. The categories aren't clear. There's very little context to really understand what's in the budget. And so we decided to do something about it. And with funding from the Tableau Foundation, we partnered with the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, which is a local organization here in DC that focuses specifically on budget and fiscal questions to increase equity in the district, to build an online tool. And so I'm going to just briefly share my screen and walk you through a little bit of what's in it. And really my goal in sharing this with you today is to just give one example of what this can look like, because I know that democratization of information is really a core value across NNIP partners, and there are lots of different ways to think about a tool like this. And I think the one thing that really stuck out to us was that it has to be jurisdiction specific. And so when we were thinking about what should be in this tool, we really started with, well, what are the main information gaps? What kind of questions do advocates have that they're not able to answer? And we actually, over the course of the project, built in a budget info session and training so that we could both share some initial data on the budget, but then also get some great feedback on where there were remaining questions, how particular kinds of data presentation and visualization were landing with the audience, that we were able to bring right back into our tool development. And so what we've done here, and this is on the DC Fiscal Policy Institute's website, we provided some overview and context, including some really high level data on what is in the budget, because we wanted to make sure that there's information here for people who weren't necessarily interested in digging way into the weeds, but just wanted to know, like, how much does DC spend on police, for example, and is it more or is it less than in the previous year? So we have things like just kind of an overall over time, and these are interactive and include the specific underlying data points. But then we really dug more deeply into where does the money come from? So really trying to break out what is federal funds, what is general funds, what is transfers across departments, giving some context for when is a decrease, and when is it just because the money got shifted somewhere else, but is kind of materially doing the same kind of thing. So then we really dug into both the spending on personnel, which is one of the main categories here, as well as some information on the capital budget. And then we also really, there's a lot of momentum and interest in police and schools. And so we made sure to include that in the conversation about the broader impact of law enforcement in the district. And finally added a resource page, because one thing that we were really noting was that there was a lot of information about both the scope and impact of policing in DC, as well as about the budget and oversight, but it was really dispersed. It was in a lot of different places. And so we, along with the tool, released a couple of reports that are linked here at the top that really try to synthesize both what's happening here in the district, as well as really taking a look outside of the district and seeing what are some reallocation discussions looking like in other communities around the country, and what lessons might we be able to learn from both the ways people are innovating, and then also where some of these conversations are getting stuck. So this is really just kind of one example, one approach to doing this kind of work. We're really interested in thinking about what this looks like elsewhere. I will drop a link in the chat to the tool itself so that you can take a look at your leisure and poke around a little bit. And I'd really welcome any questions folks would have either on this project or on similar work that you might be pursuing or interested in pursuing in your own jurisdictions. Thanks.
Thank you, Leah. Does anyone have any questions before she has to head out?
Leah, how, I should know this, but how hard was it to get the data? So was it like on the open data portal and you just downloaded it? Or did you have to like scramble through 100 PDF annual reports, or like, what was that process like?
It was definitely PDFs. The budget data is all public in terms of the numbers, but one thing that we really ran into a lot of challenges with, and actually this work was happening on the heels of a task force that had been pulled together in DC specifically to look at police oversight and accountability, and they had a lot of challenges with data requests that went unmet, and we got some great questions from advocacy organizations and organizers. For example, how much do the police spend on weapons every year that remain unanswered because we weren't able to find that information, and the data were not broken out like that. So our hope is that now that this tool is up, as we slowly and surely answer some of these questions, we can continue to add to it. But but no, certainly it was plucking numbers out of PDFs and getting them into graph format for the most part. And huge credit to DCFPI, who really did the heavy lifting there.
Do you plan on continuing to update every year as you get more budget numbers?
Yeah, absolutely. And now I think that the infrastructure for the tool is built. We very much designed it to be a living, breathing tool that can be updated and changed in conversation with local, local policy conversations, and as priorities and questions shift, we plan to keep this going so that it can continue to be a resource.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how the police and schools change this next year.
It'll be particularly interesting because the council did vote to gradually phase out school resource officers in DC schools. And so there are some really big but accompanying budget questions, and we're really excited to at least have the information out there for people who want to engage in how those resources may shift along with the policy change.
Well, thank you so much. We'll head along to Peter and Annie with their presentation from Boston, if that works. Any other questions for Leah? I know she has to head out.
Oh, I have a quick question for Leah. Yeah. Do you write a script to transfer like a data from PDF to tablet data, or you did it kind of manually? I'm asking this question because we're doing like a tracker project, also dealing with, some of the PDF files we got from the city, and all the forms have very different shapes. It's not standardized, so we're running into some issues, especially dealing with numbers of PDF files.
Yeah, that's a great question. It was, hand done for this one, but depending on how consistent subsequent PDFs are, I think that's a great idea to think about how to scrape it potentially. But they're very unfriendly, unstandardized PDFs is my impression. So unfortunately, I think it may just need to be pulled from year to year.
Thank you.
Did you get any police action reactions from the police department?
We had some folks tune in when we launched the tool. We had some folks from MPD who attended, and haven't gotten any specific feedback from them, although would certainly welcome that. We did get calls from a council member who saw this tool and was like, "Wonderful, please walk me through this." This is really cool.
Wow, that's close to home, closer to home than usually our work is.
Well, thank you, Leah.
Thanks so much. It's been great.
Peter and Annie, give it over to you.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Annie Calef. I'm a research fellow with Boston Indicators. And along with Peter, my coworker, will be presenting a project that we released at the end of September about 15-minute neighborhoods. 15-minute neighborhoods at its core is a concept that was kind of a term maybe that was coined by a sociologist in France named Carlos Moreno a few years ago, and really popularized by Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo. We decided to write a report seeking to introduce a vision of 15-minute neighborhoods to Greater Boston because we felt the concept ties together a lot of valuable land use, housing, and transportation policies in a pretty bite-sized, catchy name and way. And that just because of COVID, because of recent changes to zoning at the state level in Massachusetts, and some bare bones infrastructure that we have, that Greater Boston was in a position to advance a vision like this. At the same time, we also know there's a lot of challenges. So I'm going to walk through as quickly as possible the vision of 15-minute neighborhoods, and I'm going to pass it to Peter to present the policy levers that we put forth in the report. Would definitely encourage you to check out the report itself, as well as a video of the release event, because there Carlos Moreno himself explains it, and he does a better job than I do. And we were joined by some local leaders who I think spoke much more eloquently to the whole general concept. So our vision of 15-minute neighborhoods is broken down into 5 components. And the first are redesigned streets that include space for walking, biking, and gathering. By this, we mean streets that have robust pedestrian and bike infrastructure, places where you enjoy walking, where space is saved for gathering and community building, and streets that really prioritize high quality public transportation to not only link neighborhoods together, but also to help those who might face mobility challenges to move through their neighborhood without their own car. Some ways that we've fallen short of this vision is by prioritizing cars over all other modes of transit or mobility, leaving us with many roads that just are not like hospitable to like biking or walking or other forms of mobility. The second component of our vision, or of 15-minute neighborhoods, are accessible commercial spaces. I'm realizing now I didn't describe what 15-minute neighborhoods is. The idea is that you can walk to everything you need in 15 minutes. And so obviously, commercial spaces provide access to the goods and services that you need, but they also provide employment and entrepreneurship opportunities. Ideally, these are locally owned businesses and they're culturally relevant to the community where you live. One example of where we've fallen short is just by separating land uses. This next slide shows a map of zoning in a small suburban town outside of Boston, and I think it'll look familiar to many folks. As you can see, residential uses and commercial uses are very separated. In this suburban community, there's virtually no mixed use zoning, even around shared mobility infrastructure, right? So that makes it harder to access the goods that you might need. The third component of 15-minute neighborhoods are diverse housing options. And by that, I mean housing options that are available at a range of unit sizes and price points to ultimately support a more racially and socioeconomically diverse population. This is something that we've really fallen short in Greater Boston. I think in many places in the US, Greater Boston is dominated by single family homes and exclusionary zoning practices, policies. And so this next slide shows the number of residents within a half mile of each commuter rail station in one line in Greater Boston. And I think it really shows the effect that single family zoning has had on density. As you can see, there are many stations where there are less than 10 residents per acre in the half mile radius around the station, and even like less than 10 employment opportunities as well. And again, these are shared assets, right? We've collectively invested in commuter rail, and only 2 people can take advantage of living near it in some parts of the region. The third component is, fourth, because I can count. The fourth is strong social infrastructure. And these are places where bonds develop and community forms. We emphasize places where people can play, relax, congregate. This include public libraries and parks. It can also include public art and community-based organizations. And the last component is the most important, and that's the humans, right? Who lives there, the people. We say diverse and empowered resident population because we believe that to truly be an equitable 15-minute neighborhood, it must be accessible to all, regardless of socioeconomic status or wealth, and reflective of Greater Boston's racial and ethnic diversity. I don't think Greater Boston is necessarily known for its racial and ethnic diversity, but surprisingly, 1/3 of all residents living in Greater Boston do identify as a person of color. It's just that there are many parts of the region where you wouldn't know it. And so this next slide shows a map of the share of residents of color for each city and town in the region. And as you can see, there are many parts of the region where less than 10% of the residents identify as residents of color. And there are places where upwards of 80% of residents are residents of color. And so in our report, we emphasize that it's not just enough, for a neighborhood to be accessible or for a neighborhood to have greater racial and ethnic diversity. It also needs to engage in deliberate resource and power sharing, right? Centering the voices and the needs of those that have been historically denied opportunities or disinvested from. And so for that reason, in our policy section, we do really highlight policies that prioritize equity in both process and an outcome. And so with that, I'll pass it to Peter to share those policy levers.
Yes, thank you, Annie, for that description of our vision. I'm going to quickly share my screen, see if we can't go through this a little quick. And there we go. Okay, so yeah, my name is Peter Ciurczak. I will be heading up our kind of discussion of the state and local policy levers that we've determined could help move us towards that vision that Annie just described, but these are by no means all of the the levers available to us. These are simply the ones that A, made it into the paper, and B, made it into the truncated version of the presentation you're seeing now. So the view that we have here in Massachusetts is that we have a wrong level of government problem. A lot of our land use decisions are made, unfortunately, at the local level, and this means that a lot of towns have frozen in place exclusionary development practices that have lasted for decades. So we think that in many respects, we need to level those decision-making processes up to the state and maybe bring down a little bit more of the kind of on the ground feeling out where everything should go back to the localities. And that's a division that we kind of carry through the rest of this presentation. So to do this, we have 3 general buckets of recommendations that cover kind of zoning, mobility, and economic development. The first is we encourage zoning for inclusivity. That is zoning that encourages multifamily zoning and multifamily zoning by right. This could be done through mixed use development. As Annie showed you in the zoning map of Weston, there's essentially no mixed use development, and those are developments with commercial spaces on the bottom and residential spaces on top. And this gives a community the vibrancy that we kind of identify in the vision space. It gives you more access to restaurants, more access to shops. We would also recommend including provisions for affordable housing and tenant protections, which help, when paired with construction of new housing, help residents who currently live in the neighborhood and the community remain in the neighborhood and community as it continues to grow and benefit from a lot of the increased vibrancy that these particular methods or these levers would entail. We also would like to plan for mobility holistically. As Annie mentioned, we here in Eastern Massachusetts are really planning around the car, and that is by no means the only way people get around here. So here we would kind of end minimum parking requirements. These are actually something that Boston is going to be experimenting with quite possibly in the very near future. And these drive up costs for both housing and commercial developments and ultimately limit the kind of spaces in which you can fit this kind of vibrant urban infrastructure. We would also encourage efforts to better capture the cost of cars. This is through congestion pricing or indexing gas tax to inflation. Massachusetts, and in particular Greater Boston, is of the 10 largest metro areas in the country, the only one that does not have some form of congestion pricing. And finally, we have here in Eastern Mass a hub and spoke transit system. So in order to get to different communities, you have to go into Boston and then take rail out. So we think there are opportunities here to increase connectivity between neighborhoods within the city and communities in Greater Boston. And we'd also recommend investing in broader economic prosperity. So we would invest in local economic development that includes things like investing in streetscapes, parks, those gathering spaces that Annie identified earlier, as well as things like business improvement districts that might help bring more businesses to a lot of our kind of neighborhood cores that exist in and around the region. And when we build up those cores, we can use the tax revenue generated from these, and because all of these decisions are at the state level, we can move and shift resources around to actually target areas that have been historically disinvested in. And that might include something like allowing and increasing access to small business loans, potentially for and possibly focusing on kind of increasing access to entrepreneurs of color and people of that nature. Finally, we would like to bring some decisions onto the local level. A lot of the research in Massachusetts has shown that the people who show up to community planning meetings are older, whiter, and wealthier. And I think that's kind of holds true across the country. So there are ways we can kind of increase access to these processes here in Massachusetts, such as providing childcare for younger families so they can actually get out of town, get out to the meeting and contribute to their community's development, provide adequate translation services. Greater Boston is actually a really robust multilingual area. There are a lot of languages spoken here, and actually providing translation services is kind of a critical need for getting people involved, and ensure that planning staff are represented in the community, that they know what the community wants, they interact with the community, they get coffees in the community. This all should occur with and in concert with the community, so we don't lay prescriptive elements on the community, but they feel involved in the planning that comes with developing new housing, developing new commercial spaces. I'd love you to check out our full paper. It's at bostonindicators.org/15 minutes. You can check out our full presentation as well. And I think I'll end it there, and you can ask us some questions if you got them. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter and Annie. If anyone has one or two clarifying questions we could get to before moving on, but we'll try to hold some for the end for timing. Okay, we can hold those to the end then. Thank you both. That was very interesting. I appreciated hearing Carlos, I believe his name, at your larger presentation. I loved hearing this as well. I'll pass it over to Ellie from New York if you're ready.
Sure, great. Thanks so much. I'm just gonna put up some slides. Everyone see that? Great. Well, thank you for having me. It's great to get the chance to share some of this work on rental assistance in New York. My name is Ellie Lochhead. I'm a research fellow at the Housing Solutions Lab. And this is work that I did with my colleague, Carl Heitman. And he had a conflict come up today and can't be on the call, but I know that he would be happy to answer questions and follow up over email as well. So Carl and I are working as part of the Housing Solutions Lab, which is an interdisciplinary team based at the NYU Furman Center. And sorry, just chat. And the lab's goal is to support local policies and advance racial equity and increased access to opportunity through a range of activities that include trainings, technical assistance, as well as this research and evaluation function as well. And the lab works primarily with small and mid-sized cities. And this work on emergency rental assistance is part of a larger research effort that's led by Professor Ingrid Ellen at NYU, who's the faculty director of the Furman Center, and also Matt Murphy, who's our executive director. There we go. So I'll start off just with a brief overview of New York State's ERAP program. The program is administered by the State Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance, and it covers New York City and most of the rest of New York State. There were 7 jurisdictions that opted to run local programs instead. And that included the city of Rochester, the city of Yonkers, a few other towns and counties across the state. But otherwise, ERAP is administered through this state program. And New York, as you may know, initially got off to a very slow start allocating ERAP funds, and the pace has picked up more recently. So for the last few months, OTDA has been releasing program reports about every 2 weeks that include the number of applications they've received from each zip code across the state. And they also report the number and amounts of payments at the county level. And they give some demographic information for applicants statewide. So for this work, we're interested in analyzing the zip code level application data. And we don't currently have direct program data about individual applicants, but we can see these counts at the zip code level. So some of our initial research questions were, where are ERAP applications concentrated? Are there certain zip codes that have lower application rates than what we would expect based on the number of low-income renters in that zip code? And then we also want to know, what are the demographic and housing characteristics of zip codes with these lower than expected application rates? So as I mentioned, the ERAP data we're using is coming from these reports of application totals by zip code. And then we also have ZICTA or zip code level data from the American Community Survey. And what we're doing is normalizing the number of ERAP applications by the number of very low income renter households in the zip code to essentially get at this application rate per very low income renter household. So again, we don't have direct demographic or income information about the actual ERAP applicants, but we can calculate this rate this way. Another thing to note is that we don't have zip level counts of payments. just these applications. So we can't see how many applications per zip code were approved. So using this approach, one initial finding that stood out is this difference that we're seeing in application rates between rural and urban areas. So overall, application rates are highest in New York City, lowest in non-metropolitan parts of the state. The rate of approved paid applications is also highest in New York City and its metro area. And again, this pattern is showing up even when we're controlling for the number of low-income renters in each zip code. So to look at this some more, we have a few different interactive figures, which I'm actually going to switch over to. And these will help kind of think through some of these trends a bit more. So this first figure is just showing this general pattern that zip codes with more very low income renter households tend to have more ERAP applications, which is what we would expect. And here the orange color is showing Bronx zip codes, the blue is other New York City boroughs, and the gray is the rest of New York State. We also have remapped these application rates at the zip code level. So this is again showing the number of ERAP applications per very low income renter household by zip code. And the map is showing this general pattern again, that we're seeing that even when we normalize the number of applications by the number of low income renters, application rates tend to be higher in New York City and in other urban areas than in more rural parts of the state and non-metropolitan parts of the state. We have this interactive map in the blog post that we wrote about this work, so I can also share the link to the blog post if you want to spend more time with the map. I'm also going to go pretty quickly through some of these other figures, but these are also included in the post if you're interested in looking at those. So we have some of these scatter plots that are also helpful in thinking through some of these trends. So this first one is showing the share of renter households who are Black. And we're finding that within New York City and also across the rest of the state, zip codes with higher shares of Black renter households tend to have higher application rates. And we're finding the same correlation for zip codes with higher shares of Latinx renter households, though the relationship isn't quite as strong, especially not in New York State remainder. We also see that zip codes with higher shares of senior households tend to have lower application rates. And this could be because older adults may have fixed incomes that could buffer some of that need for rental assistance. And then within New York City, we're also seeing this very strong correlation with the share of households with children. So zip codes with higher shares of households with children tend to have higher application rates within New York City. Another variable we looked at was building size, and we were sort of thinking as building size as a potential proxy for thinking about larger versus smaller landlords. And you can see there's some variation in the direction of the correlation between the share of large buildings and application rates. And we might be seeing some of this variation depending on whether landlords who own large buildings in a given zip code tend to be more or less likely to work with the ERAP program and the tenants who are applying for ERAP. So this is something that we're still thinking about and potentially exploring further. And then finally, we also look at how application rates are correlated with pre-pandemic eviction filings. And here there's this really striking correlation between pre-pandemic eviction filings and ERAP applications at the zip code level, both within New York City and in the rest of the state, although you can see that New York has the highest eviction counts. So I'll go back to the slides. So that analysis so far, and the figures that I just walked through, we've been using, like I said, just this number of low-income renters as sort of a proxy for the number of renters who may be in need of emergency rental assistance. But that approach doesn't necessarily capture the variation in need for ERAP among low-income renters. So we've been thinking about a few new approaches for estimating the number of renter households who have arrears as a way of getting at this subset of low-income renters who are most in need of rental assistance. So one approach we're exploring is using the household pulse survey. So the pulse, I'm sure many of you are aware, but it's a survey essentially that the Census Bureau puts out every 2 weeks. And it includes questions about whether or not tenants are caught up in rent. So we can use the pulse data to look at the characteristics of households with arrears and then apply that to the separate zip code level ACS data to get this rough estimate of how many renters are in arrears by zip code. So that might help us get to maybe a more a better number for the number of low-income renter households who are in need of rental assistance. Another method we're exploring is using the data on eviction filings. And there's previous research that's found that the patterns in past eviction filings do tend to predict future eviction filings. So we can look at which zip codes had the highest filing rates pre-pandemic and sort of make the assumption that those zip codes may now have more renters who are at risk of eviction. So these are just some of the ideas that we're working on to get at a better estimate of where renter households are in need of ERAP. But we would certainly be interested in your thoughts on these methods, on what we've done so far, on some of these new ideas. And like I said, I can also put the link to the blog post in the chat if you're interested in spending any more time with some of the figures. Thanks.
Thank you, Ellie. I stuck the blog post in the chat.
Thank you.
I loved all those visuals, so if anyone wants to interact with those, they're in there. And similar as before, if anyone has any quick questions for Ellie, we could do one or two.
Ellie, are the applications online in DC? We have online only basically applications, which may explain some of the lower rates for seniors potentially.
Yeah, that's a good point. It is an online application. And I think, like I said, we only know whether the share of seniors in a zip code. So we can't identify whether there are fewer seniors actually applying, but generally in these zip codes. But I think that's a good point, that ability to fill out an online application form or willingness and could contribute to that potentially.
Or looking at the internet access and broadband data for the zip.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Great. Well, thank you again, Ellie. Layla, I'll hand it over to you for our last presentation.
Sure. Hi. Make sure my camera's working. How are you guys? Thanks for your time today and for hanging out for the last presentation. I work with Neighborhood Nexus in Atlanta. Tommy's usually on the call. My colleague Nikolai is here. He's been more involved with the Metro Atlanta Equity Atlas, and I've been very involved with our Beltline Data Explorer. So I'm going to go ahead and start with that one, also because it's the project that's furthest along. The Metro Atlanta Racial Equity Atlas, which we call Maria for our own sakes, is definitely in its infancy. But the Beltline Explorer tools are almost near the end, so we'll go over them today. Let me make sure I can share my screen before I start talking for too long. Okay, can everybody see the map that I have up? Not yet. Now can you see the map I have up? I'll go ahead and assume the answer is yes. So the Atlanta Beltline, a lot of people know it. It's in a lot of ways similar to New York's High Line. It was a very large infrastructure project, put a lot of green space into places where it was mostly kudzu before and abandoned railways. And it's had a lot of gentrification around the corridors. So they had their new chief equity officer, and I can't remember if she's the very first one they had or if she's just new to the position. She came on board and realized that the Beltline has never kept track of its data. And So we worked with them to develop a suite of tools to better understand the neighborhoods around them and neighborhood change in their areas, as well as their investments. And the investment map is what I'll actually be going to in a second. The entire project started out with this, which was just to get a handle on their population change, racial demographics in their, they call them sub areas, that's their planning areas, as well as neighborhood change throughout the city at the neighborhood level. The second phase of the project is the Investment Explorer. Originally, we wanted to put all the data onto a single map so people could see demographics and investments. You'll see in a few minutes why that is a horrible idea. And so the Investment Explorer, we built in ArcGIS Experience Builder. I don't know how technically I'm going to get into that, but if you're curious, I'll answer at the end. I'll be happy to answer questions. It is built so that this window right here updates to reflect the data that you're looking at on the page. And what we did, because their data is just so widespread, the idea is to create multiple entry points for people who are curious about investment data. And so this tool itself represents, as the little heading says, Beltline investments, and they created kind of an internal set of guidelines about what constituted an investment for each of these different areas. And then we parse them out so that if you're a casual user and you just want to see the lay of the land, you can open up this map and just click on this area. And you can see that they've spent almost $116 million in this sub area. Then you come over here and look at housing. And here you can actually get the location of investment in addition to the total investment amounts. And so this updates to reflect that. And then as you can see up here, it provides a little taste of what the parameters were around what data got included. We've got the same thing for parks and trails. One of these maps isn't going to load correctly because I'm in the middle of presenting it. So every time I click, I hold my breath. Transit and streetscapes, and of course everything like any Esri product pop-ups are all fully functional. For any Esri users, the whole thing was built in Map Viewer, which was super fun, and I highly recommend embracing the new format. Economic development. This page was the hardest one because a lot of their economic development efforts to date were in the form of business engagement. And then they started this new facade improvement program. So we ended up with some investments that were, we took it off because it was just so outsized comparatively. So, these investments are the size of throwing an event. So you're talking maybe $1,000. These ones are the size of improving the facade of a building. So then over here, you come to arts and culture. And I'm just breezing through these. I mean, I could stop on anyone, but I think we all kind of get an idea. The idea is that they should be labeled so clearly, I don't really need to explain them, but I'm happy to if you want me to. And then this is See All, and it brings it all together. And this map is the reason we did not want to put, just looking at this should give you a pretty good idea of why we didn't want to couple this with the demographic profiles map, because even though it is really critical to be able to bring those things together, having that volume of data I always call it, makes a noodly page, to use really technical language. But once you start getting all of the dots and the lines and polygons, once you start putting all of that on a page, you basically end up with what looks like a plate of spaghetti, no matter what you're looking at. And it can be a really big barrier to use for a lot of people. And we want to remove as many barriers for use as possible. So what we did in this, the Beltline, using the demographic profiles map, actually created at these equity priority sub areas, which are on every single page. What I did over here was put in a select group of equity indicators. Now, they did not use race and ethnicity when creating their equity priority sub areas, but you can see there's a pretty clear break there. But these are the other 4 ones they use. So I restricted it to just the equity priority variables that they selected. And that way people can get an understanding of how these things play out in space, but they're not necessarily getting overwhelmed with every demographic detail that exists. That is my quick overview. Ultimately, phase 3 wraps into a set of story maps, which is what we're in the process of completing right now.
Layla, do you think so there's a ton here, obviously, so it's hard to like come with those takeaways, which I'm assuming that's what the story maps are for. It's like some digesting of it. But I thought maybe you guys were avoiding digesting too much if you wanted other people to do the interpretation. I don't know.
Yeah, one of the it's a good question because it's not the first time I've been asked that. And one of the things that, well, first of all, this is the first time they've ever mapped their investment. So this is the first time they've ever been able to see, you know, been very opportunistic. I think anybody following Beltline news knows they've been very opportunistic. I don't think I'm sharing any insider information here. And so this is the first time they've ever been able to do this. So in terms of takeaways, one of the takeaways was actually the equity priority sub areas, because they actually needed to look at their data and realize, oh, these need more help. I have a feeling that's been controversial for some residents, but I don't have any, it's a feeling, it's not a fact.
Yep.
But perception is reality, right? And I had another thought on that. Oh, but because this is brand new and this is the first time they're doing it, it's hard to really develop any solid takeaways beyond that. The idea is really to create, you know, internally they're using it for a lot of research, but externally the goal is to create transparency. The guiding principle of the map was that most people, when they think about the Beltline and the neighborhoods they live in around the Beltline, they want to know how much money the Beltline spent in their neighborhood and whether they're better off for it. And I can't tell people if they're better off for it, right? That's up to them to make that decision. But now we have a tool for them to actually be able to understand how much the Beltline has spent, where it's and how it's being used.
Great. Thank you so much, Layla. Does anyone else have any questions for Layla or any of the other presenters before we wrap it up?
I just have a quick question for Peter and Anne about, so the challenge, it seems like on the 15-minute neighborhoods is there's a lot of actors that need to do a lot of things. I mean, like where the pressure points are. I guess it would be your municipalities about the zoning, right? There's probably some state policy going on there. I don't know. Where do you guys have a sense of balancing your effort in dissemination and the advocacy push, or are there groups you're handing that off to, like the transit advocates can go run and do transit advocacy?
So Annie, I can give it a shot here.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the big pressure points, as you identify very correctly, is that there are ultimately way too many decision points currently in Massachusetts, to the point where progress is almost completely stunted in many localities. As an example, the report actually includes a variety of case studies about where we think municipalities are moving towards or away from this kind of this kind of vision, and it really does highlight kind of the similarity of challenges across these areas, and moreover, how, because the challenges are so similar, like getting the land use decisions out of the locality and putting them into the state could really help move things forward.
That sounds super controversial.
I mean, it's certainly something that is complicated, but you know, Massachusetts is actually moving towards in a variety of different ways. There are a number of bills that are kind of requiring the creation of development around transit hubs in those commuter rails, and had that Fitchburg line just kind of up there showing like the 2 residents per acre. And there's a new bill that's like going to change that quite possibly significantly.
Wow.
But only if it's implemented correctly. But Anne, you want to take over?
Say super quick in regards to the point about like, who does the work? Like, are we going to do the advocacy? Are we passing it off to organizations? And so we worked closely with like a network of local advocates and had like 14 different external reviewers all like jump in and provide thoughts. I think our goal was to be a part of that conversation, like present research, which is our strength, and then, help out with advocacy as we can, but mostly we're passing it on. Yeah.
Fantastic. Carolina, I don't know, you're on mute. No, okay, good.
I was going to ask Layla really quickly, when are you going to launch the tool?
The Neighborhood Explorer?
Yeah,
the Investment Explorer. So it's live, but it's not technically launched. There's still, I'm trying to help them understand there's never, with this much data, they're never going to dot every I and cross every T, but that's the phase we're in right now. It won't look significantly different, but here and there they'll notice a point isn't exactly where the point belongs, or the line isn't, like it's in the move it a little to the left and a little to the right phase of development.
Well, thank you all so much for presenting today. I enjoyed hearing from all of you. It's 3, so I'll let everyone go. Email us if you have any follow-up questions. Thank you so much.
And register for the events coming up. See everybody later.
Thank you.